All right, this is Ricky,
And this is Brendan.
and you're listening to A Gentleman's Disagreement.
What I wouldn't give for the hope I used to find in a case of lion's head. Folks of different minds, because even though we did not share the pains we share, that American ideal, friends made over arguments in an early morning buzz. Need an early morning buzz.
All right, Brendan, it is Wednesday, April 23rd, 2025. I normally don't say the year, but it has been just over a year since my daughter was born. And I think we might have mentioned that last time, but I was reflecting a bit on just how quickly time flies.
No, it really does. And we're in an exciting month, right? We referenced that my birthday was the beginning of the month. Then, your daughter's birthday was just 10 days ago, and your birthday is coming up next week. So we're in a good run. But yeah, crazy that she's a year. I think I was over this time last year holding her and was so scared. I was like, I don't even like holding babies that are that small. Maybe that's something if I ever have my own that I'll obviously have to adjust to, but other people's babies. But to Yara and Judy's credit, you guys let me hold her. That was super nice, and so we'll always have that picture.
Yeah, we definitely will. Which is part of what I was going for. I want when she knows things, I want to be like, see this picture? He knew you when you were this big.
Oh, crazy. Yeah. I mean, and I guess kind of on those lines, speaking of time going quickly, we are rapidly approaching the 100th day of the Trump administration, and 100 is an arbitrary number, but as humans, we like round arbitrary numbers, and it's always a big moment in any administration. I think going back to at least like FDR, where it's like, what are you going to do in the first 100 days of the administration? Again, it doesn't make any difference whether it happens on the 99th day or the 101st day or the 50th day or the 150th day. In some ways, no. But it's a good, again, this is why we like round numbers. That's why we celebrate a year, because you go back and you reflect on the first year. Pick 100 days and we'll kind of reflect on the first days. And it's been a historic first 100 days. So much has happened, an absolute whirlwind in so many ways. And that's why we want to take this occasion and reflect on it. And to do that, we're going to bring on one of our good friends, a great friend of the program since the start of it, Matthew Kinch. We'll give him a full bio when he comes on. But he's a lawyer, he's a businessman, he has been a President Trump supporter from the beginning, and thought his perspective would be really valuable to have in this conversation as we reflect on the first 100 days of Trump administration, part two. All right, we are now really excited to welcome back to the podcast for the third time Matthew Kinch. Matthew is our first three-time guest, so he's always been kind of at the forefront, been a friend of the pod, and we're thrilled to have him back. Matt is an attorney based out of Tampa, Florida, where he is the founder of Freedom Shield Legal. This is kind of an all-around like legal service. What from his bio is what he says: at the heart of everything he does is a commitment to delivering exceptional legal services rooted in the principles of freedom and putting America first. He's proud to use his background in law and business to help others build, protect, and grow what matters most. He does, as he mentioned in his bio, have a background in law and business. He is a fellow Suffolk Law graduate, where he also got his MBA and his tax LLM. Graduated from Bryant University undergrad, where he got his BA, his BS, and his MS. So certainly not a guy lacking in degrees. Like I said, it's his third time on. The last time he was on was back in January of 23 when we did some economy talk, and I'm sure we'll get into some of that again today. And the first time he was on was back in January of 22 when we debated the vaccine mandates, which is still one of our top 10 most downloaded, most listened to episodes of all time. So we're really excited to bring Mac back to reflect on the first 100 days of the Trump administration.
Thank you for having me. And there's been a lot of change in my life since the second time I've been on here. I escaped the communist Northeast. I moved down to Florida, and I also got a mullet. So doing some big things over here. And, just again, thank you for having me on. And I'm really excited. Y'all have such a good podcast going, Brennan, because it reminds me of the Federalist Society debate, discuss, decide. Not one viewpoint is silenced. And that's what I really respect about the podcast, that y'all are able to come together and talk so bluntly with one another from opposing viewpoints. So it's all good stuff.
No, it's exactly why we wanted to have you back on, honestly, is we're a little bit trapped in this Northeast bubble up here. And even though Ricky and I see things differently, a lot of the kind of people that we're surrounded with are seeing things in a way that people down in Tampa, Florida might not be, or across the country might not be. And that's one of the reasons why we wanted to have you on, as opposed to, someone up here that might be a big time Trump supporter. But is still a Northeast Trump supporter. I think that's just a little bit, you're going to have a little bit of a different perspective. So let's start there. Is there, looking back at these first 100 days of the Trump administration, is there a word, a phrase, a sentence, a paragraph that you could give us in terms of how you felt these first 100 days have been?
So no administration is perfect. Obviously, we saw that in the Biden administration, but we'll see that in the Trump administration too. But one thing that has really been hitting my heart and my soul is the fact that throughout the past 4 years, as a Trump supporter, and in my opinion, seeing the destruction that the Biden administration did to this country, it's almost a sigh of relief. Just even during election night when the results came in, it wasn't easy, even as if I was really excited. It was more so just relief that things are gonna be going back to the status quo of how I think the country should be ran. And so it's not excitement. It's not anything about winning or losing. It's more so just a sigh of relief, and more so just being optimistic for the sustainability of this country. It is my belief that if Harris won, it would have been the end of America as we know it. And Ricky, I'm sure you disagree with that, but that's okay. But man, the key word here is just relief.
So what major difference or differences have you seen between the Biden administration for those 4 years versus now the Trump administration's first 100 days that make you feel this continued sense of relief that things are kind of going back to how they were or how they should be?
So love him or hate him, I think one thing that President Trump is now doing extremely well is surfacing the corruption within the government, whether that's on the state or federal level. I think there's a lot of corruption that and just blatantly waste and overhead that is just not necessary, that is coming to surface. And regardless of your political affiliation, whether you're conservative, liberal, Democrat, Republican, I think if you look at some of the news articles and stories that Doge is even coming out with about all of the various waste that's occurring, I mean, it's pretty eye opening. And so that's one thing that I think is really hitting the hammer on the head when it comes to what is being done differently in the Trump administration versus the Biden administration. So number one, waste. Number two, immigration. During the Biden administration, it's record migration into the country, unvetted as well. And so we don't know who's in the country. And for all we know, it could be drug dealers, it could be rapists, it could be murderers. We honestly don't know, because the vetting process was just it was just not even a thing. And so number two, immigration. And number three, I think now we're seeing more of a focus on better deals for the United States as it relates to the global economy. You see the tariff war going on right now, and I think that foreign leaders are starting to respect the United States again, as opposed to during the Biden administration, where it was more so all talk and no action, at least the way I saw it. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. But number one, waste, reducing it. Number two, immigration. Number three, actually being a forceful power within the macroeconomics and global economy again, rather than just being taken advantage of.
So there's a lot to unpack there, and I thought it was interesting that you started off by saying this sort of sense of relief and kind of a return to status quo or America as it should be. But maybe let's just start in the order that you presented, because I think it's one that really resonates with me in terms of how the first 100 days unfolded. So I think it would be like impossible to find people who didn't think that the government ran inefficiently in many ways. I'm curious how you thought about the like rollout of Doge. Like I think that there are a lot of specific areas that you could point to saying that, here the regulations are overly onerous or burdensome, but it doesn't appear like Doge went through a real like thought process. It just seems like they took a hatchet to the system. Is that what you were hoping for? And yeah, I guess like talk me through how you see sort of the perception of how they're going about the efficiency work.
Well, I think waste and government inefficiency can be identified on multiple fronts, right? And so just some concrete examples, and you'll have to fact check me on this, and because I can't give you exact numbers, but just from like a software licensing perspective, why was it found that there were numerous more licenses to users that would actually be able to fill those licenses, right? And so that's just like one example of with all the different technologies that the government has, the federal government is contracted with, there's a lot more available than what we actually need, right? And so like those are some like very low hanging fruit things that all right, let's take a look at these contracts and make sure that we have exactly what we need, and rather than having 1.5 or two times more licenses than the people that we do have, right? So that's one area. And another area that I think has been really successful is ensuring that from a social security's perspective, that those logs are being audited, and those logs are just making sure that there's no people that are dead with social security numbers collecting payments. And there's been numerous counts of that as well, where they're identifying things that are occurring where people are getting paid but they're on the books dead. And so it's just like, like I said, Ricky, there's multiple ways to identify waste and fraud within the federal government. And so I think the strategy is different from the different ways that they can identify it. But I think like even administration to administration, these things should be like the main focal point, if not one of the main focal points, excuse me, of the federal government. How can we best use the taxpayers' money in order to ensure things are running smoothly and efficiently, excuse me.
I think that again, like I can't there's no way to argue with that premise that we would, want the most efficient, least wasteful government. But I guess I want to press you a little bit on how Doge is operating, just specific to how they're like going about it, right? Like firing tens of thousands of workers, creating all kinds of havoc in terms of send me this or you're fired if you don't quit by next week. What, like you can't get this like severance package that we're offering, things that may or may not be legal, things that run afoul of a lot of union contracts. I'm like, it's hard for me to, as someone who believes that the federal government has a role to fill in society, to look at what's going on and say, all right, they're just identifying waste. To me, they're like, let's get rid of it all and see what breaks, and then we'll try and build back together based on that.
So to understand more, Ricky, I'm curious to know just like your perspective on how Doge is operating and the inherent disagreements that you have with it. But also, I'd like to know what you think has been a success coming from Doge, if any.
I mean, I think the biggest benefit of having someone operate the way kind of Elon Musk is around Doge is that you're gonna get at a lot of these like sort of sacred cows and things that everyone has been afraid to touch. You're gonna blow it all up, so you will have an opportunity to hopefully rebuild in the way that, whatever minimizes waste. In general, the things that I have the biggest problems with are how they're treating the federal workforce as if people who work for the government are somehow like enemies of the state and trying to take advantage of the government and not work at all. I just fundamentally don't believe that. And the amount of uncertainty that it causes people. I've talked to Brennan about this before. Like government jobs in general don't pay very well. The one huge benefit they have are like great retirement perks and stability. Like you're not worried about getting laid off. That causes some issues on the other end. Potentially, like unproductive workers stick around. But by and large, that's a big selling point of government work. And I think that by upending that, it's going to be a lot harder to get talented people working for the government in the future. So those are the things that I worry about. And not to mention that we have a very convoluted system that deals with pulling in money in one place and spending it in other places. And there are people that rely on it in different directions. And I'm worried that that stuff is going to fall apart because I don't feel like Doge is doing anything thoughtfully. Like I think their goal is to identify waste, quote unquote, but I haven't. I mean, even to like Elon Musk's like own transparency side of things, like the amount of savings that they've found has been relatively minimal. A lot of the errors that they thought, like the Social Security with dead people receiving payments, it's pretty minimal, and a lot of those things are relics of a time when we weren't like logging death certificates, so people are still in the system as alive, but they haven't received any payments. So there are things like that that concern me about how it's all unfolding.
And so what about well, some people call it Trump's State of the Union, but I don't think it was actually like an official State of the Union. I don't know if you guys, Brendan, you're muted, but there was like a long laundry list of various expenses, some of which were just straight out funny. We're just sending money here. We have different bills here, and I'm just like, how are we actually paying for these things? And so, Ricky, from what I'm listening to you about, it seems like we have different perspectives on the role of the federal government in relation to how it employs people, as well as for me, like the bureaucracy is a huge issue. And I think it's been fed so much and it's just straight up it's just obese. And I think during this administration, we're putting this obese bureaucracy on a diet and we're leaning it out a little bit. We're cutting away some fat that most certainly doesn't need to be there. As it relates to people losing their jobs and federal workers, being offered severances and potentially just losing their jobs, like doesn't mean I don't have a heart for these people, but I think the role of someone within the government shouldn't be, all right, I'm going to work in the government for all my life, and that's going to provide me with job security. That's going to provide me with all of these other perks because a lot of the positions do have union type relationships. I think the role of going into the federal government or just government in general is to serve the people within the jurisdiction that you're serving, whether it's the federal government, state government. And I don't think that time should be a forever career. That's my opinion. I think you go in, you make an impact, and then you get out. And you can provide better, if not the same services in the public sector that you can in the or the private sector as you can in the public sector. And so it just seems like, the conversation, Ricky, needs to go in the direction of the bureaucracy uh, versus the Doge talk and the cuts, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes sense to me too. And I think where I agree with Ricky is that the process has bothered me. I agree with you more on the outcome of it. Like, everything you just said about trimming the fat from the bureaucracy, I couldn't like co-sign more. I think the problem that Ricky and I would share is how it was rolled out, where, and again, we'll get into the courts, I guess, soon, but where you fire all the probationary employees and then it's like, well, you actually can't do that yet, or you fire some of the inspector generals and it's like, oh, well, you actually can't do that yet. And it just kind of seems like a mess, whether it seems so on the surface, whether that matches the reality. It just didn't seem like a thoughtful plan, even if the end goal is something where at least you and I, if not most Americans, can agree on. And I think that's how I feel similarly about your second point about immigration, where could not co-sign more that immigration under President Biden was an absolute disaster, and that we have many, many, not only thousands and hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of people in this country that we don't know what their backgrounds are, that were never properly vetted, as you said, at the border, were just kind of released and are now just in our communities. Fine, can agree with all that, and certainly the ones that have been convicted uh, of crimes, particularly violent crimes, or even that are taken to court and shown that they were here illegally, that they didn't show up for the court dates for their asylum dates, or whatever the reasons that they skipped out and are being deported. That's fine. Not only fine, but that's, I think, a good end goal. But the problem I'm having with that is the process, right? If these people just being shipped out to El Salvador without getting any due process, and if they, the Maryland man, Kumar, right? If Garcia, if we take him to court and find that he is not supposed to be here for whatever reason, or any of the Venezuelans that we sent to El Salvador, ship him out. But my problem is the lack of due process. And as a man of law yourself, does that not bother you?
So going beyond like the legal considerations, one thing that I really struggle with is millions upon millions of people just came into the country unvetted, crossed the border, and now in order to deport them, every single one of them needs an individual court hearing, and that is like the system can't support that. And if Brendan, I'm not an expert in immigration law. I'm not an expert in how immigration courts conduct their business, but think about think about how many years upon years that would take in order to process all of the unvetted uh, individuals that cross the border. Isn't there like a system in place now where you are entitled to due process, you are entitled to a hearing, but it can be elected that you wait in your country of origin until that hearing?
Yeah, and like that, those are the types of things I think are great. And I agree that the problem kind of, President Trump and his administration have come into this massive problem, right? And he's already put in place things, whether at the border or like some processes that can help ensure that the problem doesn't get worse in the future. But he's got to deal with these people, and just deporting them without hearings, even if it's impracticable, that's a problem to me.
So, so for example, you mentioned the Maryland man, right? It's been established that he was MS-13, dangerous person. Um, so why is the media trying to spin who this person actually is versus isn't.
Not established in a court, though. Just like somebody has a photo of a hand or something, right? I mean, I think this is the problem that people who are concerned about the due process have. It's like you have a few tidbits from the Trump administration that say that he deserved to be deported. He's been here for 15 years. As far as I know, he hasn't committed any crimes in the United States. And all of that is notwithstanding, right? Like he had a right to be here until he was deported. As far as I understand, he was not like here illegally. He was deported by accident.
But what I thought the whole story, because the El Salvador president was in a dual press conference with President Trump, and I thought one of the comments that the El Salvador president made was that he will be facing charges upon his deportation back to the country. I could be wrong on that, but did you hear anything about that?
Yeah, I don't know exactly that statement, but I guess my point or my response to that would be then okay, let's bring him back and try him. And if he again is convicted of charges and is here illegally, then we can take further steps. And I know like your point about the practicality is, I guess, well taken, but the alternative is that you're just shipping out people, and he might not be the prime example. I know he's like occupying so much media attention because you need to focus on somebody, but all the people, the Venezuelans that were deported out of DC and sent to El Salvador, like we have no idea if whether or not they were Tren Agua, like if they're gang members or not. And the Trump administration says that they are, but that's never been proven. And that like that's the scary part to me is who determines whether you're a gang member? Who even says that you're here illegally? If they just say that you are, then you're put on a plane and shipped out, and now you're in the CCOT, like this terrorist prison in El Salvador. That that to me, from a conservative perspective, is like a really slippery slope.
Yeah, and what I will say too is we're only told what we're told, right? And so I have belief that there's more to the story to these deportations and then what meets the eye, right? And so that's a consideration that we need to also have because I mean I don't think that if someone is here legally, has the paperwork to be here legally, can substantiate that, that it wouldn't go over well if they're just straight out being deported. And so I would suggest that there's more to the story that meets the eye and that we don't know about as it relates to maybe El Salvador has, just using that as an example, has information and belief that, all right, this person murdered X, Y, and Z, or is part of this criminal organization or whatnot. And El Salvador isn't entitled to share that with the American people. They would probably share that with the American government. But I mean, there's just, in my opinion, I think that there's just more that meets the eye than what's occurring in the mainstream media.
I think that that's interesting just in terms of like hearing your psychology on this a little bit, that you're more inclined to give this administration the benefit of the doubt than someone like me, where I wouldn't actually think that they had thought this through. But we can leave that there. I want to stick on the topic of immigration because I'm curious what you think about what's happening to some of these students who are across different campuses who are being picked up by ICE and sent to prisons in Louisiana, all of them with legal status under student visas, having those statuses summarily revoked by Marco Rubio and then being picked up by ICE and sent to prisons in Louisiana. Curious how you feel about that and how sort of your stance on small government, how that fits with kind of this clearly like surveillance type of state and picking people up without them committing crimes, right? Yeah, and sort of the First Amendment in all of that.
Sure. Can you just go a little more in depth about that particular story because I'm not educated in that current event.
Oh yeah, no, totally. And I think that's part of this discussion too, right? We're both living in two very different media worlds. But there's a student from Columbia University who was active-ish in pro-Palestinian demonstrations. He had his I think he was a Kelly, correct me if I'm wrong. I believe he was a green card holder who had his status revoked without sort of any hearing or anything. He was then picked up by ICE and sent to a prison in Louisiana where he's been for almost a month. His wife was 8 months pregnant, and he was not allowed to see the birth of his first child. Again, no charges. He's sort of in this limbo state because he's had his uh, uh, his legal status revoked. And there are a handful of these cases kind of across the country where students are having their student visas revoked, and it's I don't know, it's something that we're being exposed to a lot. I'm curious actually what, if anything, you've heard about that.
Yeah, so I haven't heard this particular story, but I mean, some baseline questions I have is, I mean, was he ever arrested? Did he suggest any type of terrorist type of ties or activities? I don't know who he is. I don't know what he did. But again, I'm not going to accept that this random student from Columbia University was picked up by ICE and put into a Louisiana prison without any type of wrongdoing. And so I'm curious to know more about his story, and I'm curious to know exactly why this occurred, because I'm sure that there's some type of reason for that.
Brendan, I don't know if there's any more evidence that I've missed. As far as I know, he gave some speeches. He's a Palestinian or of Palestinian descent. Gave some speeches that were like in sort of in defense of Palestinian people. As far as I know, he wasn't calling for any violence, but he was a very visible figure with those demonstrations. And that was kind of reason enough under this sort of blanket statement around anti-Semitism. There was another student in Boston, a young woman in her like late 20s, early 30s. I mean, I don't know anything about her, but she she looks pretty harmless to me, and she co-signed a letter criticizing sort of Tufts' response to sort of the situation, not calling for violence, at least in that letter. And so no other evidence has been presented publicly or obviously in a court of law to suggest that they were doing anything outside of kind of exercising a First Amendment right, which would be afforded to any citizen. Because they don't have citizenship status, they were able to kind of revoke their status. That is as the story has been presented, and the White House, to my knowledge, hasn't refuted any of those facts, other than to say they have discretion over who can and can't have legal immigration status here in the United States.
Yeah, look, like I think all three of us are very much in agreement about freedom of speech. There, say what you want, but we also are in agreement that freedom of speech is an absolute. And unless I see the actual statements or whatnot, like it's hard for me to say what the grounds are for X, Y, and Z. We all know that screaming fire, fire, fire in a movie theater, that's not protected. That's not likely protected speech. And so I'm curious to know what was said or what was done, and how the First Amendment plays into all of this. But I mean, absolutely, freedom of speech is bedrock, to my principles. And I'll say it again. Mayor Wu can pound sand. I said that before, and I'll say it again. I know y'all remember that, and it's because of my freedom of speech. I love it. But yeah, I mean, it's tricky too, to to depict each one of these accounts because each one is unique to the next one, right? And so it's hard. There's no blanket solution for any of this, and that's really the most challenging part. And going back to what I said about, man, millions and millions of people came here unvetted, and now each one, each one needs to be looked at individually, and that just causes such a backlog and in a tricky situation for the government because how do you practically approach a situation like that? And it's truly unfathomable. I would be able to find a solution to that. I don't know about y'all, but it's a very hard task for this administration to solve. It's almost unsolvable, in essence. I mean, millions and millions and millions of unvetted people. The system can't handle that. They can't handle, and this might be a hot take, and it might get some humor, but why did this all happen in the first place? I think it's because Democrats wanted to legalize as many people as possible for votes. That's my opinion. I don't know what y'all think of that, but I think this was a master plan in order to sway elections towards one way and not the other.
Well, as President Trump proved, demographics don't equal destiny, right? And so if that was the plan, it certainly hasn't worked out particularly well for them in the last set of elections. I would say
I will say this, if you let me interject, I think during the 2020 election, where the Republicans really dropped the ball was on the legal front. You had groups like the Republican National Lawyers Association, as well as a lot of local efforts trying to coordinate and combat election fraud. And I'll say it, I think the 2020 election was stolen. I still think it was stolen. But there was a lot on the Republican side, especially with the attorneys, it wasn't organized. The Democrats were monsters. They were coordinated. They knew where to go. Like it even comes down to, where do I park in order to get into this polling site? Like it was the Democrats had it down to a T. They outsmarted the Republicans, and they were able to push through, in my opinion, a lot of illegal procedural matters. But this time around, in the 2024 election, there was such a better coordinated effort on the Republican side. And if it wasn't for a lot of C4's efforts, I don't think we would have won this election because there was a heightened coordinated effort on the Republican side in order to combat election fraud, in order to make sure that the system does have integrity this time around. And lesson learned in the 2020 election, but in the 2024 election, we did such a better job at making sure that every legal vote counts.
You're going to take me down a rabbit hole because this is not where I wanted the conversation to go. But the 2020 election was stolen despite like there being really zero evidence of this. Like 5 years later, like where's the evidence that the Trump administration, Republican associations of lawyers filed suit in all across the country, and not one of them was successful. Like none of them turned up evidence that like there was widespread or even like small scale fraud.
Well, it doesn't need to be. It doesn't need to be, quote, widespread the way we think widespread is. If you look at 5 battleground states, I mean, was it Georgia? It was the difference between 11,000 votes. Arizona, was it 13,000 or 9,000? So it's not widespread. It's just enough to tip the scale one way to the other. And it's interesting you say that there's no evidence. There's massive amounts of evidence out there from laws being changed without the actual procedural ways to change them in some states. I just actually had, I don't know if you know who John Eastman is, but he was Trump's attorney during the 2020 election, and he was actually prosecuted for his representation of President Trump. And so I just had him down in Tampa, and we just did a fireside chat. And he stands by what I'm saying right now, that number one, it was stolen. Number two, there's an incredible amount of evidence that is out there in order to prove that it was stolen. And number three, that a lot of the court cases that were just being tossed out were on not actually the merits, but just very, very crazy procedural grounds. And so it wasn't actually tried on the merits. Evidence was never brought to light because they were just being tossed out on procedural grounds. I think that's a big difference too. How can you try a case and say that, oh, there's no election fraud, no election fraud, where you were never able to submit evidence and prove your case because it was just tossed on very crazy procedural grounds. And I know I'm talking generically here, but this happened in multiple courts, right? And so it's hard to say, oh, this procedural ground versus this procedural ground. But that was like the general theme of what was occurring.
All right, we're not gonna kind of agree on that, but that's okay. But let's transition into the economy. Your third point, and one of the beauties of having you on is not only do you have this legal background, but you also have this business background. You're a small business owner. You've founded multiple kind of small businesses, including your law firm. You have a background educationally in business as well as practical experience doing it. Has President Trump's approach to the economy been what you expected, and uh, how have you found it so far?
Man, so I look at the economy in a few ways. Back in 2023, or during the Biden administration, we saw rates just triple. Okay, and so I'm going to first talk about the interest rates and how that affected my life, and where I hope interest rates go, because I think it's important to the overall macroeconomic trends. So back when back when interest rates literally tripled under the Biden administration, um, I worked for an independent mortgage bank, and so our business, it has a direct correlate. The success of it has a direct correlation to how interest rates are headed. And so when interest rates tripled, right, nearly tripled, you saw a lot of independent mortgage banks without servicing portfolios going out of business. And unfortunately, my company was one of them. And so just in terms of the real estate market, there was a lot of consolidation, a lot of layoffs, and it was, I think without, because the Biden administration just just kept printing, and so as it relates to like different sectors within the economy, um, man, it was rough. It was rough, and so what I hope the Trump administration does is creates a strategy in order to lower interest rates to revitalize a lot of the industries that previously got destroyed. Because I mean, the real estate market, for example, got destroyed. The mortgage industry got destroyed. And so that's my hope, that just number one, interest rates, they get back to normal. There was, for a while before the tariff war, there was a very promising trend back to normalcy, at least in our lifetime. But because like in the 80s, it was like the interest rates were like 17% to get a house. But I'm not even praying for 2 to 3%. 4 to 5% would be great. But that's number one. Number two, um, I am really I'm really excited to see what happens with this trade war. And, oh, God forbid I can't touch my 401k for the next year. I'm not even going to touch it for the next 30 years. And so it doesn't matter if to me, I mean, I'm just talking in terms of my perspective. It doesn't matter if there's like a little dip in the S&P 500. I could care less. I mean, when you're investing, when you're making those it should be long-term investments. The tax code incentivizes long-term investment. And so the people that are freaking out, I think, have more skin in the game than most Americans. Most Americans, I mean, they're really just concerned about the price of eggs, the price of groceries. Hey, can I actually buy a house before I turn 50 years old? And so I think these points, the Trump administration values and prioritizes. And I also think from a tax perspective, there's a lot of promising ideas circulating. For example, wouldn't it be nice if we could eliminate the federal income tax for folks that are making $150,000 or less? Like that is truly valuing the everyday American. And I really do think that is what the Trump administration is trying to accomplish.
So, in terms of like the eggs and being able to buy a house, are you hopeful that these tariff policies, if the Trump administration is able to kind of deliver on some of these bilateral deals with all of these nations that they're going to lead to, lower grocery prices and potentially, a greater, more money in people's pockets so that they could invest it how they want to or invest in a house if they needed to?
I mean, I hope so. I think the whole play with China right now is there will be some short-term pain. There's no denying it. It's like trying to get a parasite out of your body. They're gonna fight like hell and they're gonna make you sick. But before you know it, that parasite leaves your body and you're healthier as a result. I think that's the exact same thing that's happening with this trade war and tariff war, where if you want to think of my actual opinion about what is going to happen, is I think Trump is challenging all of these nations that are our allies to create fair, equal tariff exchanges. And once enough enough countries are on board, I think then China will be cornered and they'll have no choice but to make a fair deal with the United States. I'm sure y'all have seen like the comparison of tariffs between the United States and like other countries are just they're not equal. Like they're so one-sided. And truly I don't know when these deals came into play. I'm sure they're updated regularly, but like to have such an unequal exchange of tariffs, I mean, it's not putting America first. And so I really do think that it's piece by string. Yeah, it's putting our foot down and saying, I mean, because we are the number one consumer in the entire world. I mean, we are, and so all of these countries rely on us to buy, consume, consume, consume. But now, when we're trying to make a fair deal for ourselves, like, whoa, no, so it's just it's I think it's going to be pain before we actually see the light. But for me, I'm willing to accept that.
I guess I'm thinking similarly about the tariff situation as I am about the Doge. How do you feel about sort of the process? Like tariffs today, tomorrow we make up, the next day I'm still mad at you, and now it's twice as much as what I said 3 days ago. I think there's a perception that America is not this place of stability anymore in a way that it had been really since the end of World War II. Do you feel like that perception, or I mean, have you sort of heard of that perception from the international space, and kind of what do you make of that? And what do you make of like the Trump tactics? I understand kind of the end. Well, I might have a follow-up on what you think the end goal is, but I at least understand some of the rationale in terms of exactly what you said. There are other countries have some tariffs on our goods that are higher than other tariffs that we've had, so we got to sort of level the playing field or however we see it. I'm curious, yeah, what you think about the process on the tariff front.
I mean, the way I look at it, we've been getting ripped off for far too long. I mean, Trump was even talking tariffs back in, I think, the 80s or 90s, essentially saying the exact same thing that he was saying now. And so to me, I think the tariff situation is the old guard in the sense of it really hasn't been touched. It hasn't really gotten any type of media attention. And so I think a reason why President Trump is so effective is because of how unpredictable he is. And so if I look at a situation and this is the way we've done it for so many years, but then it's created bad deals for us, I say you shake things up and you're unpredictable and you think outside of the box in order to solve this issue. And so I'm okay with how the process is playing out because it's something that's never been done before or challenged before in a way like we're seeing it now. And so it excites me and I'm like I said, I'm willing to feel the short-term pain because I think it'll bring long-term sustainability and a solution that is actually permanent to stay.
Would you say the goal then is, or I guess, yeah, what would you say the goal is? Is it to reshore a lot of historically the exported manufacturing, or is it to negotiate better deals?
I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I mean, one big issue is China, right? I mean, China is a threat on so many different fronts. They employ cyber attacks. They steal American IP. They manipulate their currency. If we lose Taiwan, man, if they invade Taiwan, I mean, Taiwan is the bridge between us, the Pacific, and China. And so that would be extremely, extremely, I think that's one of our biggest threats, in the international space. But we have so many inherent problems with China, but yet, man, do they ship a lot of goods to the United States, right? And so we're in a situation where we're so dependent and reliant on them that what we're doing is slowly but surely creating a more balanced front, especially as it relates to China in trade.
All right.
What are your guys' opinion on? I'm curious, like how do you think we should approach a country that's number one, communists, number two, that, as I just mentioned, launch cyber attacks on us, that steal our IP, that manipulate their currency, that cheat, and so like how would y'all approach a situation like that? Like I'm curious to know, like, would you do anything differently than the Biden administration, the Trump administration? Because it's a topic that I think will be news lines for years to come because that's just how powerful they are and how intertwined we are with them.
Sure. So obviously, none of us are experts on U.S.-China policy, but things that stand out to me that I kind of agree with you on and with the Trump administration on is that some of these goods or even more kind of like processes and manufacturing processes that we rely on China for is that we have to reshore some of those jobs. In the worst case scenario where we're cut off economically or we get into a military conflict, like some of that stuff we have to make on our own, and we're kind of not right now. We've been so dependent on them that we need them, and we wouldn't want to be placed in a situation where that we're in a conflict and for whatever reason we're at a loss. We're not ready to kind of scale up in the sense that we need to. I will say that I generally am in favor of maintaining positive economic ties, and that doesn't, free trade, free but fair trade is totally good. I think we had on a China, more of a China expert, Michael Beckley, a couple months ago, and he was suggesting that we need to push China more militarily, where we need to kind of reorient ourselves away from wars in the Middle East and even wars in Europe, and have much more of a military focus on China to let them know that they can't invade Taiwan, they can't mess with Japan or South Korea or with the Philippines or Australia and India, whatever, right? Some of our like military allies over there, so we need a much stronger focus there. And yet maintaining positive economic ties hopefully prevents that from happening. And again, that doesn't mean that it's just status quo and business as usual, because some of the currency manipulation stuff is real, and some of the tariffs that they have that we didn't have were real. And so that doesn't mean that we just kind of accept the status quo. I applaud the Trump administration for wanting uh, to renegotiate some of that stuff, but I think alienating and trying to cut ourselves off economically or putting economic pressure on regimes often leads to military conflict that I'm not totally sure we're prepared for. So that's my China pitch or summary
Hmm.
right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think the only thing I would add to that is that China, beyond just being cheap labor, has a very highly sophisticated manufacturing division that has a lot of, automation and robotics and things like that that I think we would be interested in developing here, but is going to take time. And so when we talk about short-term pain, I'm not entirely sure how short-term it is because of our reliance on our ability to get cheap goods. Everyone talks about China's suppressing their currency. Well, what does that legitimately mean for Americans? It means our dollar goes much further on Chinese goods than it is going to go on American things. So if we're at the same time not able to meaningfully raise wages in the United States and the cost of goods goes up, I think you're just going to have a situation where people are equally unsatisfied with, what they're earning, and then on top of it, unable to buy more things. Now, from my perspective as someone who, purports to care about the climate and things like that, maybe it's not such a bad thing that that a lot of those cheap things become more expensive and people buy less of them. But that's something else I have to contend with.
Are you referring to like um, China's emission policies and so forth, or
I mean, just in general, like the amount
oh,
of
okay.
added emissions that our rampant consumerism, global consumerism causes, Trump throwing a monkey wrench in the whole thing by initiating these trade wars is probably going to have more of a positive environmental impact than literally anything that progressives have tried to do over the last 10 years. But we'll
Well, except for lockdown everyone during COVID-19. That was great for the environment.
Huh. And
In-
last thing I want to talk about and touch on, Brendan, I'd like to hear your perspective on it. Is the DOJ and these settlements with very prestigious law firms, and it's very relevant to us because we're attorneys. What are your thoughts on everything happening right now?
I think it's been very effective from the Trump administration's perspective. They've essentially used the power of the federal government to cow some of the most major international law firms into agreeing to billions of dollars worth of free legal services for causes that he wants. I think it's a disaster in terms of like the of independence of now you go out and represent someone that is, now quote unquote like an enemy of the current administration, and now the administration is going to blacklist you. That might make sense. Right, you not saying you personally, but you might be like, well, good, these people deserve it. They persecuted President Trump and his family for years, and so this is just, come up, turnabout is fair play. But what I would say is like, if what if the shoe's on the other foot? Like this is, I don't think so different than what happened like with McCarthyism, where it's like if you don't agree with us, you're kind of getting blacklisted, or you either play ball on our terms or you don't play ball at all. And so, yeah, I've been disappointed in some of these major law firms of not kind of standing up for themselves and their individual lawyers' rights to represent someone. Like we saw this on the other hand with, it's funny that Kirkland and Ellis has, sorry to that particular firm, but they're one of the firms, they're the biggest international law firm in the country, in the world. They're one of the firms that have cut the deal with the Trump administration. But what happened is they had an attorney that argued the Bruen case, which expanded Second Amendment rights in challenged New York law, and then it kind of expanded Second Amendment rights across the country. And he was kind of forced out of the firm because they didn't want to be associated as the firm that like expanded gun rights in the country. Where it's so that's where my problem is just as easily as the Trump administration is weaponizing kind of the federal government against these law firms because he feels he's been persecuted or they've done things that he doesn't like. That could easily happen with the Harris administration in 3 years, and that's the concern for me.
It's super, as attorneys, what I'm really just frustrated about is I feel like it's a ping pong match at this point of next administration, where they're just weaponizing it's lawfare. They're just weaponizing the legal system against one another. And I just pray that we get back to a time where attorneys can represent their clients without fear of retaliation, right? Like I just mentioned John Eastman a few moments ago, but he's facing disbarment in California. He's facing lawsuits in both Arizona and Georgia just for representing President Trump, right? And so, like, where was this outrage 4 years ago? Where was this outrage when the shoe was on the other foot? And so, I don't know what the solution to that is, but it's extremely alarming just how quick it sways back and forth, and how fast. If you have the gun in your hand, are you pulling that trigger? It's super interesting, and I think I'm praying that it ends sooner rather than later, because like Brendan, we're both attorneys, and like we need to stand up for what is right, and we need to stand up for just the core belief that representation without retaliation. Now, obviously, if you're filing like frivolous lawsuits and you're doing things that are illegal, then yeah, you should be held accountable. Like that's a no-brainer. That's common sense. But we're in a time where that's just like it's going beyond that.
Yeah, people are getting penalized for representing people that other people don't like. I mean, I know that was kind of confusing, but that's the point of the best part of our legal system is that everyone has the right to representation, and they should get the access to the best representation they could possibly have. And to put sanctions on people because you didn't like who they represented, that's a huge problem. So I think we're agreed on that. Ricky and I have talked a million times about with the reason that we have federal judges are confirmed with 51 votes now, or in with the Supreme Court, is because the Democrats did it first, and the Republicans said, "Well, now we're in power, we're going to do it." And like it's a race to the bottom. And what the solution is, you have to have an administration, and I would argue that neither of these last two administrations have been willing to put the gun down. You need to have someone that is willing to do that. All right, I do. You've been more than generous with your time and your perspective here. Are there, we're still just in the infancy of this second Trump presidency. So what are you looking forward to? I know that it's so easy to kind of react and overreact to all of the things that have happened, but to either, it's been a historic first 100 days, right? Like we've always said, if you're a fan of President Trump, you have to be in a lot of ways thrilled with how much he's gotten done in 100 days. And if you are, against President Trump and what he stands for, you have to be horrified by how much he's gotten done in the first 100 days. So who knows what we're looking at for the next 3.5 years? But what are some of the things that you're looking forward to?
Man, I've been supporting President Trump since 2015.
That is true. There's no documented
and
100%. Yeah.
man, and so even through January 6th, I've always backed him because he's just the dude. And so what I'm looking forward to is I just hope and pray that the people around him are giving him the most best and sound advice, because he's not surrounding himself by dummies. I mean, these are like them or hate them, these are some of the most intelligent experts in that's out there, right? And so I'm looking forward to seeing this cabinet, seeing this administration think really outside of the box. I mean, RFK, I mean, that's going to be, him eliminating like, colored dyes, right? Like there's just so many great things that are in the pipeline. RFK launching an entire study on why autism is on the rise. Like all of these things that I'm like, wow, this is going to like, in my opinion, President Trump is trying to benefit every American, trying to make every American, have more opportunity in their lives. And so there's just various ways that can be done, whether it's financially, whether it's health wise, and there's just so many different initiatives that the Trump administration is taking head on that I just want to see play out. I mean, the Maha movement is elite. I love it, right? And that's just like one of the most unique things about the Trump administration, I think. It's just, there's just going to be so many things of like, how do we actually make Americans healthy, right? It's just like, it's kind of crazy that it's such a focal point because it's never been like that in previous administrations, the way I perceived it. And so I'm just really excited to see how a lot of these initiatives are going to play out.
Well, speaking of healthy, look, you look great. Florida's done you well, whether it's the mullet or I know you're off to a workout shortly. So it's wonderful to see you. I appreciate we appreciate you continuing to come on and share your opinion perspective. This is, exactly why we wanted to have you, and we appreciate all of that. And when it comes time to have someone on for the fourth time, you'll be my first.
Ha!
Yeah.
Well, Brendan and Ricky, thank you so much for having me. I'm always grateful to get the invite, and I'm praying for both of you, and I hope the world is doing you guys right, whether it's career wise, family wise, and I just appreciate the opportunity, and it was a pleasure.
Wonderful. So right back at you. The same good wishes on your end and to you and yours. And yeah, we'll talk to you soon, hopefully.
Thank you.
Again, huge thanks to Matthew. Not only was he a very good friend to me when he was up in Boston, but we've obviously kept in touch now that he's down south. And this is like I said to him at the end, that's exactly why I wanted to have him on, because you and I were kind of banding about doing this first 100 days. And again, even though our perspectives are different, we knew Matt would bring his own opinion, his own lens to look at the first 100 days, and he did, which I really appreciate. Uh, obviously we're going to have our disagreements. I don't think when we have people on, I think Matt, to his immense credit, is always willing to be pushed back on. Matt's always willing to hear other ideas and perspectives and have the debate about it. Go back and listen to that vaccine episode if you doubt me at all. But we also don't have like forever, time in this space in this medium to fully excavate some of those disagreements that we had, and that's fine. People are probably listening to this and thinking that Matt should have pushed us more in some ways, or listening to this and thinking that you or I should have pushed him more. But again, his perspective is what I wanted to get at, and I think for me, one of the biggest takeaways is just that we're kind of consuming information differently, which we know that you and I also consume information. Not only we have different sources of information, but it's also clear that we consume different amounts of information, and the things that we're diving deep on, you and I and Matt, are not all the same, and that makes a difference. One thing, I guess one other thing that stood out to me in that conversation is something that you had pointed out, where Matt is just super willing to give the Trump administration the benefit of the doubt, right? And if they say something, whether it's with government efficiency or immigration or the economy, he's pretty much willing to take that at its face value in a way that maybe you or I are more willing to give some of the media that like the benefit of that and say, like, that's not the reporting that I'm hearing on these subjects. And I think that's a really interesting place where we're not necessarily going to see it, because he's saying, well, the Trump administration is saying one thing and I trust their information, and we're saying, well, the reporting that I'm reading is saying differently, and we trust that information. And uh, that's a difficult place. But even given that, we're still able to have a conversation and not only have the conversation, but agree that we're going to disagree on some things. But also, I do think there were um, parts of that, particularly, I didn't expect to get into that question you asked at the end about the major law firms, but that's a place that seems like we all are in agreement. So that's why, and I think it was a valuable conversation, and his perspective is valued and appreciated.
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, you mentioned when we were thinking about doing this episode that we had to get somebody who was a supporter of the president, and as he said, he's been on the Trump train for going on 10 years now. So yeah, we had to hear that, and it exactly like you said, it just sort of reinforces this notion that what we're seeing and how we're kind of making sense of the headlines, and the particular headlines that we're reading, make us feel a certain way, but that's not how everybody is feeling. I am curious, he has been a longtime supporter of the president, like, what some of those more newer converts or people who are on the fence going into election day, how they feel. And maybe we can sort of expand uh our horizon a little bit that way, because again, they're, if they haven't been a part of this movement for 10 years, maybe there is a little bit more buyer's remorse there. But it's always good to hear, and always interesting to just get that check on yourself, like, oh my God, like this is happening, that's happening, but this is what I'm reading. And he's like, what story? What are you talking about? I hadn't heard anything about that. And so that's yeah, it's just interesting and eye-opening, and always good to have these conversations. Whether yeah, whether they like scratch our itch in the right ways or not, but they're certainly good for us.
For sure. We would love to hear how other people are feeling kind of across the spectrum. As Ricky kind of alluded to, there's people that are the never Trumpers and have been the never Trumpers for 10 years that are now saying, I told you so. And there are the people that have been supporters of President Trump for 10 years and are saying, I told you so. And the vast majority of people are somewhere in between. And so please let us know. You can find us on Instagram, _gentlemen's_disagreement. We're also on YouTube, but this interview will be up there probably in short order. You can go back and find some of our other ones. But yeah, please reach out to us. We'd be super curious how you are seeing and feeling and experiencing these first 100 days of the Trump administration.
All right, I suppose with that, we'll leave it there. Till next time, buddy.
I'll see you.
All right, Brendan. So we are a couple days out from our recent conversation with your buddy and now one of my friends, Matt Kinch, where we talked about the first 100 days of the Trump administration. And so after that episode, I messaged you sort of saying I felt like we touched on a lot of topics where it was clear that, at least I felt this way, that certain things that I was bringing up, like I actually didn't have a great grasp of exactly where things stood and what was generally known at the time. So I'm thinking about the case of the Columbia student Khalil Mahmood, or the tough student Ramea Ozturk, but even more broadly about the state of tariffs and reciprocal tariffs and things like that. And it honestly got me thinking a little bit about how I have been consuming media in the past couple of months, where if something smelled wrong, if it looked like it was a government overreach by the Trump administration, I was more inclined to read it that way and just move on, if that makes sense. It was sort of part and parcel for like what I would have expected. And honestly, part of it is just sort of the chaos of the last 3 months, right? There's just like a different news story all the time, and it's a little bit hard to keep up. But I think the other part of it is just that is how I have been reading the news. It's like one of those things where you start to read it and you feel like you know what it says, so you kind of skip. You're skimming it, and it's like, all right, I get what's going on. He's violating somebody else's rights or whatever. And then I no longer am paying attention to the actual details, and I'm less likely to form my own opinion. So I thought we could take a second to just like revisit a couple of the things that we talked about. And I don't know, maybe I looked into some of them a little bit more after. I don't know that my opinion necessarily changes, but I do think it's important for me, for us, for everyone to not like assume the conclusion that you think fits the narrative, I guess. Is that weird?
No, I think it's very thoughtful of you. It's why I like having these conversations with you. We recorded that episode with Matt, like you said, 2 days ago, and everything that I said in the post, like the aftermath of that interview, still applies. Like we bring people on here to get their perspectives. One of the reasons I wanted Matt in particular on was to get his perspective of someone that had been a longtime Trump fan, that was living in the South here in the United States, that consumes different media than you certainly do, and for a lot of different media that I do, uh, and also has a background in law and in business. I thought he was like uniquely, his perspective was like uniquely valuable to our conversation, our reflection on the first 100 days. When I maybe I'd already said this 2 days ago, but you and I had planned to do a first 100 days reflection, and we could have just done it the two of us. But as much as we disagree on a lot of things, when it comes to much of Trump and his administration, we have found ourselves aligned, which you, Ricky, have always counseled me over the course of the last 4 years of this podcast. When everyone's kind of in agreement, that's when you should be kind of looking around to be like, let's double check here and make sure that we know all of the facts. And I think that's why I appreciate listening to Matt. But as I said, in the immediate aftermath of speaking with him, I was, I guess maybe not surprised, but it did stand out like how much he was willing to take President Trump and the administration at their word, at face value of it. And it again, if you are a fan of President Trump, and we have close friends who are, we've talked to them on this podcast, about them on this podcast before, and my conversations with them will be very similar. It's almost like you're hearing the Trump talking points just kind of repeated back to you, and I think that's a huge credit to President Trump. But the way that Matt was kind of was, and I guess Matt's also someone like most people don't have time, and I think he's super open about this to say that I'm not super aware of these issues, or I'm not an expert in it. Like I have a real job and a real life, and I don't spend my whole day consuming media because I don't have a podcast and I don't need to necessarily do that. And I think that's much more closely aligned with the vast majority of Americans than you or I do. So I think again his perspective is valuable there. Um, with that said, I think some of the things that were bothering you were that we didn't necessarily fact check him, and that might not be the right term for it, but we just kind of let it go, perhaps with not as stiff as a challenge as it could have been, and that didn't sit right with you. And I think that's fair. That's why we are 2 days later coming back and recording this for people that maybe have felt similarly after listening to that.
Yeah, yeah. And I guess I should say I don't necessarily intend this as like I want to revisit arguments that were made and sort of say that, definitively I was right on something or whatever, he was wrong on something else. I do think to to your point that a lot of Trump supporters and really I think this goes for anybody who supports kind of any political movement. You just trust your guy not to be the one taking advantage of you because honestly the way that political movements work is that your guy tells you that everybody else are the people that are taking advantage of you or destroying the country or whatever it is, but your guy is the one guy who's not going to be doing that. And so I can't necessarily think that Trump supporters are going to be any different than anybody else. Like I will be the first to admit, and you were one of the people who pointed this out to me that like under the Obama administration, we deported more people than any other than any other administration. And we've talked about, extrajudicial killings outside of the United States that nobody really ever brought up. So there's going to be some like tinges of hypocrisy, but insofar as we're talking about specific things that are happening today. It is probably, or, happened in the recent past. It is worthwhile to know what exactly it is that we're talking about.
All right. So where do you want to start?
Let's start with Mr. Garcia, the man from Maryland who was sent down to a prison in El Salvador. Did you end up looking any more into what his situation was?
Yeah, I feel like I had a good sense of it too, but it was more just like, did we really want to get into the weeds with it? Is there anything you want to say?
No, I mean, I guess I will say I didn't quite know that he had first entered the country illegally and then was granted this pseudo form of asylum. He came here 15 years ago. He's only 29, so that means when he entered the country he was 14. So the claims that he's a big time El Salvadorian gang member, to me immediately that sounds fishy. But again, I think for you and I, the purpose of our defense of him is again a process thing. It's like if he is guilty and of being a gang member, also he was here illegally, and all of the other things fit our criteria for, or, the legal criteria for what it takes to deport somebody who has some semblance of legal status plus is protected for one reason or another, then that's fine. Go through the process, deport him that way. Instead, what we know to have happened is that he was basically deported accidentally, and then it's gone through a bunch of different stages of court cases all the way up, and the courts have said, you guys need to bring him back. And right now, the Trump administration is saying, shrugging their shoulders. Is that right?
Yeah, that's fair. He was great, like you said, this special form of asylum, I think back in 2019, which said that he couldn't be deported back to El Salvador because there was real fear that he would be persecuted and potentially like a high likelihood that he would be killed if he was sent back to El Salvador. Matt said, and Stephen Miller, kind of Trump's and the architect of much of Trump's immigration policy said, quote, that he was a member of a designated foreign terrorist organization ineligible for any form of relief under law. And again, what I think you were just saying and what we said to Matt was that might be true, right? Like Matt was kind of saying like we don't know, or like these I bet the government has more information. That very well might be true, but your point is the same as mine of okay, well go prove it. Matt's counter to that was of course that's not practical to give every single this as he hammered over millions as he hammered millions of times. There are millions and millions of people here that were unvetted during the Biden administration. I don't think that either of us, but particularly me, are going to dispute that that was a huge problem over the course of the last few years and one of the main reasons that President Trump got elected. It's a huge problem that any administration would have to deal with. But again, to me, it's not it's not to throw your hands up and be like, all right, well, we're just deporting everyone that we allege is a member of a foreign terrorist organization or was even here illegally. And I think it's hard. Stalin said that like one man's death is a tragedy, but a million is a statistic or something like that. Where I think the reason that people have grabbed onto this Maryland man, Kilmar Brego Garcia, is that like we can this is someone whose story it is, but there are other stories too. I think there was like a makeup artist out of the DC area who had what's appeared to be, according to ICE agents, like gang tattoos, which his family was saying is actually just kind of Real Madrid. So he was like a Real Madrid supporter and got like the crowns that Madrid has, and so they associated that with gangs and they deported him. So like yeah, like I understand the point of why are you wasting all this time crying over people that are here illegally that are already kind of broke the law in the first place, but it's larger than that. And my point has always been that if the government can pick up somebody off the streets and just say that they are a member of a foreign terrorist organization and ship them out to a terrorist prison in a different country, they could do that to anybody.
Yeah, that's really the entire point around due process, is that if you skip the due process, then you can do this to literally anybody. And then you can just throw your hands up and say we can't do anything to bring them back. So that is what it is. And beyond sort of these cases, there have been other cases of actual American citizens who happen to be Hispanic or Latino looking, or Hispanic or Latino, but happen to also be citizens who have gone through sort of similar experiences with ICE. And that's really, I think, the problem. And I'd say the other thing is there's consistently this conflation of, the millions and millions of undocumented people with everyone's unvetted and they're just pouring across the borders, because that's not exactly true. And then on top of it, the Trump administration focus on criminals and gang members and things like that, which again, people would hardly argue that, like, oh, okay, that sounds right. But if we have millions and millions of people and they are all criminals and gang members, we have a very different situation and problem than what is clearly currently on the ground, which is not that. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that nobody is, but you would think if there were tons and tons of unsort of registered, illegal migrants within the United States, all of them criminals, we would know about that. But really, the Trump administration and broadly has just had a hard time like finding these cases. Whenever they do find a case, trust me, you know about it because they're, running up and down Congress saying, look at what Biden did. This is all his fault. Anyways, so I think that is one case. Now, the other two cases that we referenced that we didn't sort of expound upon, that Matt had also said that he didn't know much about, but was again just sort of assuming that it fit, or that the sort of the government knew something more than we did. I'm curious if you looked into it any more to see if you found anything that the government knows more than we do.
Again, they might. They haven't said anything to me or in a court of law that they had not said anything to me or to anybody uh, that they do, right? There seems like this. There's been a lot of kind of stonewalling and silence and just a generic, uh, you know, writing on behalf of designated terrorist organizations or things like that. My impression is that for Mahmoud Khalil, the Columbia student, ICE might not even had a warrant at the time when they picked him up. He did certainly have a long-term, like, quote unquote green card, like a perm as a he had application in for to be a lawful permanent resident. The Ramaya Ozturk, Rumeza, I'm definitely not saying that right, but I think that one always that stood out. One, because that's for you and I, it's here in our backyard. But two, there was video of it and how scary it was, where she was walking down the street and then is like essentially accosted by six ICE agents and put into a van, and then all of a sudden is in Louisiana. Again, I have heard or seen no evidence, but I'll disclaim is that I don't have all of the evidence. I don't have all the information. The government very well might have more information that hasn't been revealed or that I haven't read. I would encourage everyone to go and do their own research on these people, but from everything that I have seen, that any evidence that exists hasn't been pro-offered to any sort of authority to back up what's happened to those two individuals.
Yeah. I will add that I don't I have yet to really see it, you know, the Trump or Trump's administration be one to hold on to facts and evidence that they think would sway people in their favor on these particular cases. So that to me is telling. But yeah, I guess nothing more to say about that other than it's a scary thing.
Well, the only other thing I would say is that even some of the media I consume, which would you would not say is are these kind of the mainstream liberal classic media that they were always have hated Trump. It's if you look at like the editorial pages of the Wall Street Journal, of like the National Review, of the Free Press, these are not liberal publications, and all of them are expressing the same concerns we are. So if people are out there listening to this and being like, well, they're just parroting talking points of the mainstream media, again, that may be a fair criticism. I don't think that it is, and I would just encourage everyone to do their own research on this.
Yeah, yeah, fair. All right. So I had one other one that I was thinking about on the sort of economic front, but anything else that we talked about that you wanted to cover?
I really don't want to get into like litigating the 2020 election anymore. Like Matt's right, plenty of the lawsuits were dismissed on procedural grounds, but plenty more were decided on the merits in Wisconsin Supreme Court, the Eastern District of Washington, the Eastern District of Michigan, the Arizona Superior Court, and the Nevada District Court, the Maryland, the District of Pennsylvania, the Northern District of Georgia, the District of Arizona, the Wayne County District Court, and the Superior Court in Maricopa County, just to name a few. Courts in all of those states decided them on the merits. Again, these states are Georgia and Arizona are not liberal states. Michigan and Wisconsin are as purple as states get. That's all I really want to say on that.
I think that is well said, and yeah. So at some point arguing about the 2020 election is the exercise in futility, I believe. All right, so then there's kind of this notion of tariffs and just generally how President Trump has been characterizing our economic position around the world. That America has constantly been on the short end of the stick, getting the raw deal, and he is the one to fix it. What have you sort of read about that? What are your thoughts about that?
It depends who we're talking about. If you're talking about like the American worker, I'm not sure that I totally disagree. Obviously, these trade deals have allowed us as consumers to have enormous, unprecedented access to cheap goods and services around the world. Uh, I think they've also done a lot of good for a lot of other countries in the world in terms of, I think it's one of those like rising tides lifts all boats sorts of things. Uh, I think there's a lot of kind of like macroeconomic factors that go beyond just bilateral or even multilateral trade deals. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, I think I have to just go back to like the general idea of where America's position is in the world. We are,
oh, here,
right?
say that was an awkward pause, and the reason it was awkward pause is because I was like, I have something else to say. But what I was going to say was I think that the Trump administration has long I don't know if confused is the right word, but use like trade deficits as evidence that the United States was getting taken advantage of. And essentially what that means is that we're buying more from those countries than they're buying from us. And there are massive trade deficits with lots of countries in the world, including China and the Philippines and Vietnam and South Korea. And again, so you fact check me on all those too. But uh, in Mexico and Canada too, right? Uh, but the reason is because as we all said, that the United States, we're such voracious consumers, is that we're just buying a lot of things from all over the world, and our economy has changed. We don't make things here in the same rate that we used to. We've transitioned a lot of our economy to more of like a service economy or more of a tech-heavy economy, and I think there are fair arguments to be had around those. But just because we have trade deficits with countries doesn't necessarily mean that we're getting taken advantage of by those countries.
Yeah. I mean, that is basically the sort of the premise uh, or like the sort of the notion of free trade and how it's mutually beneficial because each country can sort of take advantage of their comparative advantages, whether it's in natural resources, labor, or products and services. You know, from the United States, obviously we sell a lot of services, and I think the thing that I keep going back to is that we're the richest we're the richest country in the world. So
History of the world.
in the history of the world, nominal GDP, right? So it's interesting to me that he has honed in on tariffs as being the tool that is really, I mean, like the class that he's playing to is still the white sort of lower middle class that has been displaced by manufacturing jobs being pushed overseas. But again, like a lot of that to your earlier point was done to lower the cost of goods and to effectively improve people's lives here. And like you said, trade deficits do not necessarily mean we're being taken advantage of. In some situations, you would expect them based on sort of the relative position of our country from a like a wealth standpoint. Like if we have 10x, 100x the amount of money that another country does, it would not make sense for them to be sending us as much money as we are quote unquote sending them. But again, we're getting things in return for this trade deficit. as if we send them money and we get nothing back. So I don't know. That to me is it's just like an interesting talking point that keeps getting surfaced that doesn't necessarily mean what he says that it means almost. Yeah. I guess we can.
Yeah, you're not getting any disagreement
Yeah.
from me there. All right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Even like the reason that the tariffs, that kind of famous or infamous chart that they had in the Rose Garden that one day, and you had all the Twitter sleuths that were trying to figure out how we did, like, how did we come up with 83% for Egypt but only in 57% for Israel? Like, where did they come from? Essentially, it seems like they took the trade deficits. Like that's just where they came from.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. I mean, not that is also a key tactic of the White House, like trying to be transparent but not necessarily fact checking their own data. Anyways, we can we can leave that here. I hope people found that interesting or that the discussion was helpful. I don't know that it necessarily, like you said at the end, would assuage folks who are, wanting to fight either us or Matt on any of the points that we made, but it is probably important to put some more of the actual record out there and not just sort of the talking points that allude to the record when we can.
Right. Yeah, that goes for both sides, and no one needs to take our word for it. But I think that's a little bit if we're going to put out a podcast and try to be educated and knowledgeable about these things. There is, I feel like, some responsibility to ourselves, to each other, to whatever the audience is, that we're doing our best to try to give as full and complete a record as possible. And I hopefully between the conversation and this addendum, we've done as good a job as that as we could.
We're trying.
We're trying. Sure are.
All right. I suppose we can finally leave it here. Till next time, buddy.
I will see you soon. Yeah.
What I wouldn't give for the hope I used to find in a case of lion's head. Folks of different minds, because even though it did not share the pains we share, that American ideal, friends made over arguments in an early morning buzz. Need an early morning buzz.